I'd like to welcome you to the Sociology panel for today's Race and Genomics conference. The next talk will be Hiroshi Fukurai on genomics and race, social, political, legal, and performative construction of race.
Okay, before I came here, I did some research about the genomic areas, and I tried to find very controversial cases that I can use in my presentation. And this is what I found: genomic basis for alcoholism. And I found a number of research that has done that focused on the number of populations, but most prominent, the race or ethnic group dealt with the Native Americans, Irish and Aboriginal in Australia, because it is true that they have a high rate of alcoholism. So I was reading some of those research as well as critiques. And like American Indians, Irish, Aboriginal, common disorder, and alcoholism is certainly one of those biggest problems. They also suffer from high suicide rate, short longevity, depression, and drug abuse. And I'm not sure whether you have read the Chris Hedges, Days of Destruction and Days of Revolt. I'm not sure how many of you have read it. Okay, this was written by John Suckle, and he's the co-author. And the whole book was trying to make the invisible visible, using cartoonish illustrations. It's not working, is it? Thanks a lot. Okay. And this is a Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And it was like a 90% unemployment rate for the past 6 decades. And the one thing that the theme of the articles that criticize this genomic research, especially on trying to search for and identify the gene that is responsible for the high rate of alcoholism, is the fact that all the research, at least genomic research, had failed to focus, realize the fact that those races and Irish ethnic group suffered the colonial history for hundreds of years. In the case of Irish, it's more than 1,000 years. And they've been subjected to genocide, they've been subjected to slavery, and as a consequence, they lost their traditions, language, identity, and memories. So those social scientific researchers had pointed out they actually suffered the trauma for hundreds of generations. And they concluded that they were not sick people, but they used the term, they were wounded people. Again, whether you believe what they said is true or not, but nonetheless, they criticize genomics tend to justify colonial conditions with the use of gene as an explanatory cause of disorder. In other words, saying the research somehow disinterested in interrogating the origin of colonial policies and programs. But nonetheless, they focus on its symptoms. Okay, it's very, very important. And also, they criticize the lack of analysis of knowledge power dynamics, especially who gets to define race. Native Americans themselves do not call themselves as one of the racial groups. Okay? And who does research? So they're all knowledge and power dynamics operating in the entirety of the research, especially biological or genetic research of race. And what I try to present here is that race is a contrivance, is a constructed concept. Race doesn't exist in nature in a way that we understand it, but rather it's a social construction, it's a political construction, it is also a legal construction. The court has a stake in defining who is black, who's white, or who's Asian. And also there is a performative element in it. So that's what I try to present in my presentation. And let's start with Susie Phipps. And those who have read The Racial Formation, written by Michael Omi and Wynand, those are two graduates of UC Santa Cruz and teaching at the Berkeley and Santa Barbara. And they use Susie Phipps as an example of race is a social construction. She's really confused because she thought she was white all her life. But she tried to get the passport and got the birth certificate. She found herself as being designated as colored. So without her husband's knowledge, she hired a private detective, spent thousands of dollars, and tried to find out her background. And she found out right here. The great-great-great-great-grandmother was enslaved the woman by the name of Margarita. And there are a few other, the African blood. And in Louisiana, the government passed so-called 132nd law of racial designation in 1970. And since she had found out the third legal limit of being black, she got the 32nd African ancestry roots. She was outraged. And this is what she said. I was sick for 3 days. I am white, I'm all white. I was raised as a white child. I went to white schools. I married white twice. My daddy and mommy were buried white. My driver's license says I'm white. And she sued the Louisiana Department of Vital Records. And it took about 5 years to get the result. It reached all the way to the Louisiana Supreme Court. And she said, if I lost in Louisiana, I would go to the Supreme Court of the United States. If I lost there, I would go to the president. And I would ask him, not her, but nonetheless, I would ask him if he thought I was colored. And this is the result of lawsuit. The New Orleans District Court said, nope, you're black. And she appealed, went to the Court of Appeals. It said, you're black. And she appealed to the Louisiana Supreme Court, which said, you're black. So she is legally black, but socially white. Okay? But what happened here is that 1 year after the Supreme Court in the state of Louisiana state legislature decided to repeal 132nd law of racial designation because many people found out they were black. And in her particular case, her record of ancestors were not destroyed, including Civil War. It survived. And that's one of the reasons she was designated as black. And Tulane professor testified that 5% traceable black genes exist among average American white, whatever gene it is. So if that rule applies, and if the Louisiana 132nd rule applies, then all average American white should be designated as black. That's a scary thought. And this is a passing element. This is Homer Plessy. I'm sure you have heard Plessy versus Ferguson. If you read the Supreme Court case, you realize this has to do with the passing. Homer Plessy has passed as a white all his life. Well, unfortunately, he was outed when he was traveling in a white section only of the freight train. He was outed by the conductor, and he refused to move. Okay, he was actually designated by U.S. Census, the octoroon. He got 1/8 of whatever the African blood means, but nonetheless. But he passed all his life. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court. That's Plessy versus Ferguson. So it has to do with a performative element of race. And another one here is Babe Ruth. He was probably also an octoroon. He was an African. And Thai cops refused to stay in the same hotel using N-word. But the internal struggles among white baseball players were being suppressed because of the fact that this person was very important in the promotion of baseball in 1920 and the 30s. So that was a business decision to make sure that he was treated as white Otherwise, he has to shift his body into the Negro League. He would not be able to play in the Major League. This is the study I have done in 1999, and then I published this in a law journal from Bolt Hall. And I made it into one chapter in a book, which came out 2003. I surveyed the UC students, the freshmen, and I identified all kinds of questions, but two main questions: their racial identity and their knowledge of racial ancestry. And among white self-designated students, 19% of them had American Indian roots, 5% had the black ancestral roots, and 3% had no white ancestral roots, but nonetheless, they identified as white. And among black students, half of the black students were white ancestors, and 2/3 of black students had the American Indian roots. And when I looked at the people with the ancestral roots, especially African ancestral roots, how they changed from the being black into other racial groups, I found the majority of people who knew they had African ancestral roots no longer identified as African. They migrated their identities from being black into mostly white and Hispanics. And those racial designation is quite important. Like, for example, the racial identity has impacted how they actually view the racially very controversial issues. I found out, as far as affirmative action policy is concerned, the strongest opponent of the affirmative action are self-identified white students with black ancestral roots. And strongest supporters came from the black students with white ancestors. And this is the government designation of race. And government, for the first time in 1790, used a racial designation to collect the information of the US citizens. And they had three designations: free white, slave, and others. Okay, free white doesn't mean those people who came from Europe, but those are actually people from Europe with property. That's what it meant by free. Slave is a property. Others are mostly European immigrants who came here under the contract or servitude. They were not classified as white. And that trend continued 1810, free white, slave, and all other persons. Some freed colored person added 1830. And the actual black in the form of census category was first used 1850. So it's more recent category. And also mulatto. Then Chinese was added, Indian was added. In 1980, as I said, the octoroon, that's Homo Plessy, was being added, as well as quadroon, that's 1/4 of African American blood, as well as Japanese. And black now being supplemented by Negro 1990. In 1930, one of the subcategories of racial designation included the Hindu, as well as Mexican. Hindu is actually a religion. It's not racial designation. And Hawaii, Filipinos being under US control since 1898. Many people began to migrate to the United States. So census category has to be invented. And 1980, now US government had decided to introduce Hispanic as the ethnic category, not racial category. And again, year 2000, black is also being equated as African Americans, and Hispanic, Latino, Spanish added. So, and white is now defined as a person with origins in any of the original people of Europe, Middle East, and North America, not exclusively from people from Europe. It expanded the inclusive categories. Now, this is the most recent category. We have 5 categories: African American or black, white, American Indian, Alaska Native. Used to be Asian and Pacific Islanders, API, but nonetheless, it's being severed now. It's Asian as an independent racial group, and Pacific Islander is now being augmented together with the Native Hawaiians, and they have others. And also, race is a legal construction. The court has a stake in defining who is what. Immigrants challenged the legal definition of white because unless you are being designated by the government as white, you cannot become US citizen. So many immigrant groups had challenged the non-whiteness in court. And first successful non-European group to be granted legally as members of white is Armenians. That happened in 1909. Then many people from Syria and from Middle East start to challenge the whiteness. So it's also a legal construction. And the current, when I did the research in genomic research, I started to find a lot of medical genetics and genomic research in the Muslim. And there was one report said the first Arab genome sequenced. That's a very interesting research. But when you think about Muslim include people from Arab, at least in the United States, South Europeans, former Yugoslavia republics, the South Asians, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. And indeed, Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world. It has little more than 300 million population. 98 to 99% of them are Muslim. So it's not Middle Eastern countries or North African countries. The largest population of Muslim, it's Indonesia. It's Asian. And they have also many Chinese people living in a western region near Himalaya. And many Africans, African Americans, thanks to the influence of Nation of Islam and Black Panthers. So conclusion, race is indeed a social contrivance, being defined by OMB, that's Office of Management and Budget, that defines categories as well as meanings. And Supreme Court also has a power to define the racial meaning. And one's knowledge of history, economic, political objective, and performativity also plays in racial politics. And also historical moment and the power knowledge. 150 or 60 years ago, 70 years ago, there was no racial group called black. It was all based on the property relations. And let's say from now on, say 50, 60 years ago, kind of racial categories that we may have, we think that truly exists on the basis of biology or genomics, may not exist either. And also power knowledge, who gets to define race and its meaning. So biogenomic research, I hate to say this on race, may fail in establishing its scientific legitimacy. Thank you.
So I want to thank all of the speakers for their fantastic and very informative talks today. I'd like to start doing a Q&A, and I'd like to start with some undergraduates or graduate students who happen to have questions first. And if not, I'd like to open up the floor to non-undergraduate and graduate students.
So I really love the talks. It's just great to see all this interdisciplinary thinking about the topic. I have a question, just more clarification of Professor Fukurai, I think. The studies that you did on the UC students, which was very interesting. I want to sort of see the detailed pieces of the study. But I just had a quick question about how you measured ancestry. Did you actually, I was just interested as to whether the sort of views that the students had actually was a function of their ancestry or just believed ancestry, right? Because if they're self-reporting their ancestry, their actual ancestry didn't really have much to do with their views that resulted from that self-report. So I'm just curious as to what you were measuring. Was it ancestry or believed ancestry?
Okay, you asked two questions. First one is you want to see more detailed the reports of this. And second one is how ancestral roots being measured. So first one is there was a journal came out 1999, one of the law journals from the UC Bolt Hall. And if you search LexisNexis or Westlaw using my name, you should be able to find the article. And if you want to see more detailed, the survey, because I asked all kinds of questions. Racial identity as well as ancestral knowledge. It's just a small part of it. And I made it to the book, it's called Race in the Jury Box. It came out 2002 from the SUNY Press. Okay, for second question, I simply asked on the basis of their knowledge. I asked simple questions. Choose one race using the racial designations being determined by the US government using census category, okay? The second, I put any ancestral roots you know you have, please check. So some people checked white, some people checked only, or some people checked white and black, some people checked black and Asian. So there's a multiple numbers of responses on the basis of their knowledge of their ancestral roots. So that was based on knowledge. And so there was a program called SPSS, it's called the multiple response analysis. And that's specifically designed to analyze the differential number of categories. Because some people may answer only one. Some people say check 5. And then I cross-listed with self-identity. And the table you can find on those two journals. I mean, the one journal and the one book.
Well formulated yet, but I'm intrigued by, in a way, it is about the crisis of the visible when racial legibility becomes the problem, right? So when the blackness of Henrietta Lacks was reduced into the cervix cells and sort of became invisibilized, but then the attempt, it's also almost a detective story in order to retrace the visibility of her blackness, right? And then in Hiroshi, you're talking about the ancestral quantum, blood quantum. It also has to do with the what is visibilized and what is invisibilized. So it seems to me that in the whole race discourse, no matter what kind of concept of race we're thinking about, the discourse of the visual or the ocular obsession seems to be one of the haunting subtexts. And in a way, for me, genomic study seems to be a method of distantiating from the obsession with the visual by going to the moleculars and genomes or whatever. But it seems like the visual constantly comes back into the picture and kind of like legibility, right? What becomes visibilized and what is invisibilized. And, so that's not a very well formulated question, but it's a puzzle that I'm trying to think through. Thank you.
Is that okay to add to the HeLa cells? The HeLa cell has also a very racially neutral elements to it because it has been used in biotech research areas to invent all kinds of vaccines. Like a polio vaccine was actually invented thanks to HeLa cells. And also it invites kind of analysis of the pharmaceutical industries as well as economic capitalist system and how this cell was being framed and constructed as a way to milk profits into those corporations. So it's not just a race, but also it invites all kinds of questions in economic, political power. So that element needs to be incorporated. As to the invisibility question, that's a very, very, very good question. And I may relate to what John said about how the Latinos or Hispanics ally themselves with Africans and whites and others. If you look at the most recent 2010 US Census, half of those people who identified as Hispanic, they also identify as white. So as ethnically, they were Hispanic, but racially, half of them are white. But if you go to, like for example, in the state of California, half of the Latinos, Hispanic identified people, they also identify as white. But if you go to Florida, like 85 to 86% of Latinos, Hispanics identify as white. So Hispanics and Latinos are not really one cohesive, homogenized groups, but it has a tremendous diversity in it. And by using Hispano-Latino actually eliminates the very complex, the mixture of groups within that. And same as use of white and Asian and so on. The same thing can be said there. And also visibility, besides visibility, that deals with the notion of identity. Because one good example would be the group called Seminoles. Seminoles are the collection of decimated tribal people in around the areas of Panhandle of Florida in 1780. They also incorporated runaway slaves into it. So they became, runaway slaves were not there to exploit Native Americans. So Native Americans actually incorporated it into their ways of life. They became Indians. So you have black Indians, even though they identify themselves as Native American. And they fought mightily against US Army, but they lost it. They've been dislocated to Oklahoma and others. But what's really unique is that they allied themselves with the Native Americans and the Mexicans when there was a war in Texas, 1845, because the Americans presiding in Texas refused to give up the slavery as being mandated by law, passed by the Mexican government, by the second president, by the name of Vincent Guerrero. He was the second president of Mexico, and he was also a former slave, black. And American settlers refused to give up. And then those Seminoles traveled all the way to Texas, fought along with the Mexicans against ranchers. And they lost it, but some of them continued to fight until 1848, when the Mexico was defeated and had to give up the northern portion of Mexico. That's why we live in Santa Cruz, used to be Mexico. So, in the case of Seminoles, it's visibly they are black, but culturally, identity-wise, they also identify as Native American. So it's more complicated, not in terms of just visibility, but also the identity, the ways of life they adopted.
And Hiroshi, could I add that a group of the black Seminoles ended up in northern Mexico, in Coahuila. Nacimiento de los Negros, I believe is the name of the community. And so they are Mexican citizens. I think they still speak Muskogee as well as Spanish, as well as English, and they have connections with the black Seminoles on the other side of the border. I mean, that's a complicated mix.
Another case of the Miskitos, the so-called Miskitos, Indians in Nicaragua too. They are very, phenotypically are black, but then eventually they claim some notion of indigeneity. And that also in the Amazonian region.
Do we have other questions?
Hiro and Sandra. So you're both address passing, but I think in addressing passing as protecting, it seemed like protecting a category of privilege.
You raised a very important question on passing. And you also imply that the passing may be a problem to some extent. And I would say passing is part of reality. And we do engage in passing all the time. Because maybe you may not, passing to be a good husband, passing to be a passive. There are all kinds of elements that you can actually engage in the act of passing. And I can tell you the one concrete example. I had a student who was legally blind in sociology. And he refused to be given the right because he wanted to pass as person who has being visible. And so despite the fact, the students and it's kind of dangerous to some extent, a legally blind person walking on the street. But nonetheless, he tried to pass as the ableist student. And that happens all the time. So because we have the kind of a hierarchy of privilege, and it's so obvious in terms of gender and race. And the passing is part of the reality in dealing with this unequal hierarchical structures imposed upon all of us. That in any situations, you see that passing can actually bring some kind of benefits to some extent, or maybe reverse is true, depending upon the situations. So as long as you live the hierarchical structure, like the society we live. Passing is not a problem, it's part of reality. You have to engage in it to be able to survive.